the way we have been building user interface prior to using Vue.js and UI components, it's okay for small applications. For medium and large applications, you will get a lot of benefits if you adopt a single page application SPA architecture while using UI components, using a framework like Vue.js or other competing frameworks like Angular or React. So in this session, what I will be doing, I'll go through and explain to you what Vue.js is about, what you can do with it, what are the features of Vue.js, and show you its capabilities through demos. So this is the outline. This is what we aim to achieve in this session. First, to get a good understanding what Vue.js is and how it fits in the big picture. Second is Vue.js allows us to build our user interface as a set of components. Rather than user interface being one piece, we break it down into UI components. And this UI components, it has two parts. The UI component has a template and has some object associated with the template. I will explain what this means. Now, an application is made up of many components, and definitely these components need to communicate with each other. We will see how components communicate with each other. Then, as web developers, we heavily use forms to collect data from users, and we will see how Vue.js can help us to do this, and also help us to do validation of what the user types. A new concept on the client side called client-side routing. I'll explain what it is. And there are a couple of tools that come with Vue.js, help us do the development of the application. I will also explain them. So let's see what is this Vue.js is all about. I showed you where it fits in the picture. It basically allows us to build a more complex UI by breaking it into components. So Vue.js is an open source framework that allows us to create single page applications, and it allows us to do so by enabling us to build UI components. And I will be explaining what these UI components mean. The Vue.js also has a client-side template engine where I can create a template, get the data, and merge the two to create the view. And that's what I'll be explaining as well. Vue.js is not the only player out there. It is heavily competing with many other frameworks, particularly Angular. This is just to remind you how SPA application looks like. So on the server side, we have our logic exposed to the web through Web API. And on the client side, we have our user interface. And this time, it will be Vue.js components. So this is how it looks like. So if we build a Vue.js application, our user interface will be really a tree of components. So have a look at this fictitious example of a store, an e-store website. So you can break down this UI into multiple components. For example, here you have the navigation bar as one component. The product search is another component that you can build and test separately. You have the shopping cart, could be another component. Each product, the details of each product could be a component. So really, your application at the end of the day becomes a tree of components. And the good thing is each of them can be built separately, tested separately, and then you can build the full UI by composing and combining these components. Even for team development, for teamwork, it's much easier. You can divide the work even at the user interface level. Each of the team members could take care of a couple of components. And of course, if you have a complex application, one way to deal with complexity is modularity. If you have a complex thing, you break it down into smaller units, makes it much easier to approach, much easier to build, and much easier to understand and maintain. And that's what Vue.js is all about, and what Vue.js will allow us to do. This is another example of how an application, a user interface of an application could be seen as components. So in here, again, the product search could be one component, the navigation bar another component. If you have some carousel with some products advertising some products or news or notifications, you can put them as another component. Each of the products is also a component, and even the stars could be a component. The good thing about components, you can build it once and reuse it in many, many places. The footer itself could be a component. So this is just to give you kind of a glimpse what I mean by component-based user interface. No longer you say, oh, this is a web page. No. This is, yes, it is a web page made up of components. That's basically the idea. So now let me explain how Vue.js, how you can use Vue.js to build components. So we all agree that our user interface is made up of components, these green boxes, and at the end, in terms of code, it's a tree of components. That's what a user interface is at the end of the day. Now, before we dive deeper, let me give you the very high-level architecture of Vue.js. It might not make too much sense now, but after we finish, I'll come back here and explain it a little bit more, and it will make a lot more sense. So, in a component, what we really have, we have a component in Vue.js has two parts. There is the visual part, which is a template that you can use to define the user interface. And then there is an object. There is a template that has the user interface elements, and there is an object behind it. And the Vue.js sits in the middle between the model and the view. Okay? So let me now just kind of explain what a component is, and we will go together and build one so we can see what a component really is. So a component is, here is a nice diagram that explains what a component. What are the elements of a component? Template plus an object. So in a template, what do we find? The user interface elements. And in the object, what do we find? This JavaScript object, it provides data that will be displayed in the template. Also, if there are some events that, let's say, the user clicks a button, then that event will be handled in the object associated with the template. So it's a very simple concept. We have a component made up of a template plus an object. Okay? In the template, I have the user interface elements. In the object, I have two things. I have the data that I will be displaying in the template, and I have methods to handle events that are coming from the template. That's basically the idea. Now, concretely, in terms of programming, this is how Vue.js components look like. So a template, as you can see here, template is within a template. So you go ahead, you create a file, you call it whatever name you want. In this case, it's hello.vue, which is basically a hello component. It has a template, and the template defines a paragraph with this greeting. Greeting is a property coming from the object associated with the template. So basically a template has, a component has three sections. The template, a script section, and style section. In the template section, I basically have the user interface elements, and I can read and write data from the object. Also, I can erase events. Okay? Now, in the script, what do I have in the script? In the script, I provide data that will be displayed in the template. I can also have methods to handle events coming from the template. And in the style section, what do I have? the styles to make this, to change the styles of these elements, or the look and feel of these elements. That's basically the idea of a component, and we will look at this very, very concretely. So that's what a component is. It's a file made up of 3 sections: template to define the user interface, script to provide the object and the methods to handle events, and script section to provide the style that is applicable to this component and only this component. So you can see here the component has everything it needs in one unit. Okay. And basically here is the interaction between the view and the template. So the template provides the user interface. It gets its data from the object using something called property binding that I will explain shortly. And the template raises events to the object through something called event binding. And I will explain what this means. So this is the basic idea of Vue.js components. Before we move any further, let us take an example and do one example together, and then we can continue. Client. So in the application, I have 2 parts. I have the client part and the server part. Yeah. Okay, so npm run serve. I will create another one here, cd server. I will start the server separate and the client separate. cd server, and then I will do here node, because this server is a Node.js application, so I'll just do node app. Of course, you will practice this in more details in the lab. Okay. And MongoD. This is just to start MongoDB server. And then I'll come back, rerun this, so it should be okay, hopefully. So the server side, I'm really using it for the API. Okay. So here is, for example, the API /heroes, and it gives me the hero. Here is the Vue.js based application. This is based on Vue.js. Exactly the same behave. But using Vue.js. And you will see the power of this as we move forward. Very, very powerful frameworks. Makes life much, much easier compared to using plain JavaScript. So, to get started, let's start with this. Let's build together this calculator. Let's have a look how it is done in plain JavaScript, and then let's do it in Vue.js. Okay, so let's start with JavaScript version, plain JavaScript version. So plain JavaScript version, I will find it under JS. So here is the calculator user interface. Have a look at the calculator user interface. What I have here, this is an input to get number num1. This is a drop down to select one of the operation. Then I ask the user to enter num2, and then if I click compute, it will go ahead and run this code here in JavaScript. And if you remember what this code is doing, it's going and to the document and grabbing this element called num1, and grabbing the element num2, grabbing the operation, and then doing the computation, and then it generates some string and assign it to the div, and that's it. Okay. So here you can see here JavaScript. In JavaScript, you're doing everything yourself, imperatively. Do this, do that, do that, and then in Vue.js is a bit different. So in Vue.js, the first thing we have to do is we will create a component, in this case called calculator component. And the calculator component will have the HTML, will have the JavaScript, and we'll have the CSS. Okay. So here is this what I showed you here is the plain JavaScript. You already know how to do this. Now to use Vue.js, the best way, one of the best ways to do it, is to use command line interface, a command line interface that comes with Vue.js. What you do is you go ahead and install something called CLI, Vue Command Line Interface. It allows you to easily, you install this once. You see here this -G, it will install it globally. You don't need to install it for every project. You install it in the whole machine, and whenever you need it, you can just make use of it. Now, once you install it, you come here and you create a Vue project. In this case, I call this Vue project client. You can call it app, you can call it whatever you wish. For me, I want to make it simple. I have the server that will provide the API, and I have the client that will provide the user interface. So I'll go ahead, open a new terminal, and I'll type this, Vue client. You will have an SRC where you put all your source code, and underneath the SRC folder, you have a subfolder called components. And these are the components of your application. One of the components happens to be calculator. And as you can see here, the calculator has 3 parts. The calculator components has 3 parts. There is the template part. This is, you can imagine, it's a copy-paste from the HTML. But I didn't bring the body, the scripts and all the stuff. It's a partial page, only the calculator part. So, and then in the script, I put the logic. I will explain it shortly. Okay, and then here I put the style relative to this component only. It's related to this component only. So here, for example, I want the operation. You see here this operation. I want it to be 40 pixels, and I want a margin in all sides of 8 pixels. And I want the calculator, the whole calculator template, to be in the middle. So I put here text align. So this is just some styling. Now, what I will focus now on this script. Okay, the script, what it's really doing, it is creating an object. Forget about this one. This script has a couple of methods that you must have. And what this data does, it returns an object. Can you see it here? Yeah. It returns an object. In this case, it returns an object that has how many attributes? 3. num1, num2, and the operation. And you can see these attributes, or these properties, let's call them properties. These properties map nicely to the elements I have on the page, on the template. So on the template, how many elements do I have? 3. num1, num2, and the operation. So I have to create corresponding variables that correspond to these 3 input elements that I have in the template. And guess what? I have these properties and I have these template elements. What do I need to do? Connect them. What's the technical word for connecting them? We call it binding. I bind what to what? I bind the user interface input elements with the data properties. With the data properties. Have a look at this. What's the magic? How do I do the binding between the UI elements and the data properties? I use this. We call it directive. It's an attribute that comes with Vue.js. And this attribute, in this case, is called vModel. What this vModel will be doing? So what will happen is, any value that I put here will show up in this input. And if the user changes it, it will write it back to the property. So I am doing a two-way binding between the properties of the data object and the input elements. So for example, have a look at this. Have a look. So if I change this one, let's say I initialize it with 20, 10, and this one is 2, and this one I initialize it with star. Okay? Now, if I go to the calculator, what do we expect the input to be? The num1. 10, this one to be star, and this one to be operation. So you can see what's going on. So for every input element I have in the template, I have a corresponding property in the data object. And then what I do, I bind the two. Yes? Any change I do to the property will be reflected in the UI, and any change I do in the UI input, it will be reflected back on the data, or the properties. Yes? So have a look. If I come here and say calculator, you can see here, did you see what happened? Yeah. I didn't enter anything. And have a look at this. Have a look at this result. Magically, if I change this, get changed immediately. Have a look. Yes?
But now there's no point to the compute button.
Yes, you're right. I'm just that's true. I'm only putting it here to show you the features of of Vue.js. But you're absolutely right. I don't need this anymore. And have a look at the very complicated code that is behind this. Okay, here it is. What I have here, so you can see here, have a look. What I have here is that I have this data function. I must have it in my object. And what is the role of this data function? It returns an object. And what this object has, the properties that I need in my component. And these properties are accessible by the template. Yes? Then this object also has another property called methods. And a method is a property that I can provide as many functions as I wish. One of the functions now is called compute. Yes? What this compute is doing, have a look. What this compute is doing is basically taking num1, this num1 here, taking the operation, could be multiply, whatever it might be, and taking num2, evaluating the expression, and assigning it to a result, and returning the result. Yes? Now, inside the template, what I'm doing here I'm reading. I'm basically reading from the object and displaying in the template. So in here, I will be reading the value that the user have entered for num1, displaying the value that the user have entered for operation, and displaying the value that the user have entered for num2, and then calling the compute function. That's it. What you see here is exactly equivalent to the JavaScript version that we have seen. So using Vue.js, I no longer need to do things like this. Let me show you here. I no longer have to do this anymore. Query the DOM to extract the data. I don't do this anymore. It's all declarative. I declare the properties that I need in my object. I bind them with the UI elements, and that's it. It's not my job anymore to read and write from UI elements to properties, to data properties, and vice versa. I just link them once and let Vue.js take care of synchronizing them. And also have a look at this. I no longer come to go to the DOM, get certain element, and write to it. I don't need to do this anymore. I only do things programmatically in my object, assign the result to some value, and then use this. We call these directives. Use these directives to to display properties from the data object into the template. What I have, just to summarize, I have the template that has the UI elements. Yes, that has the UI elements. And these templates link the template, or I link elements of the template with properties returned by the data function. Then I can create methods to handle events. Here is an example. I raise an event from the template and handle it in the object behind the template. So what I do here, here's a button, and I put here @click. Can you see this @click? And equal to the name of the function that will be called when this button is clicked. So this is what we call the event binding. This one is called property binding. I am binding UI elements, particularly here input elements, with properties, data properties. And here I am binding an event with a function call. When this event happens, this function will be called. Now for property binding, for a two-way binding, which directive do I use? vModel. And for event binding, there are two syntax I can use. I can either see here vOn, that's one way of doing it, or shortcut is @. Now if I just want to read, I'm not doing two-way binding, I just want to read the current value from the object and display it in the template, I just put it in double curly brace. And this will give me access either to the properties, or I can even call functions if I wish. Is this clear? Okay, so let me show you one more example. Here is another example. Here is the bulb. So what I have here, have a look. What I have here an image with the source, and I have here a button. And what I'm doing is, when the button is clicked, I grab the image element, and then if the text in the button is on, I will change the image to off. Otherwise, if it is off, I make it on. So it's basically toggling between on and off. So now it is off. When I click, it turns on, and then when I click off, it goes off, and then, like switch, it's either on or off, and this changes, the image changes from this like switched off image versus on image. So let me show you how this is done. You've seen how it is done in plain JavaScript, and now we see how it is done in Vue.js. So in Vue.js, to do this, what should I do? Create a component. What's this component? I will call it bulb component. And what are the sections this component will have? Template, script, and style. Yes, very good. That's it. Let's have a look how it is done. Here is my bulb, and here is how it looks like. Here is the template. The template looks exactly the same, copy paste from the HTML before that I had before. Okay. Now here is my code behind. So what I have here, I have two properties that I care about in this particular component. I have the image source. The image source, it could be either off, on, or off. And I have the button text. Remember, the button text could be on or off. These are the two properties I have. Now what do I do with these properties? I need to bind them. I need to bind them with the user interface. In here, I need to bind this property with this attribute. So I can either do it with this directive called v-bind, the attributes, which means this value will be assigned to this attribute. Yes? A shortcut of doing this, I can just do it like this, without vbind. Just colon in front of the HTML attribute. Or if you want, you can do vbind. So either way, okay? Now the input box, I am binding the value which is could be either on or off. I'm binding this value to the button text. I am also binding the click event to this function called toggle. Can you see here? There's a function here called toggle, and this function is exactly the same as we saw before. If the button is on, I make it off, and vice versa. If the image is on, I make it off, and vice versa. So that's it. This is the actual code. There is the template very nicely. Here is the data behind the template, and I link the two using bind, attribute binding, and using event binding. And then I am linking the data with the template declaratively. Just doing this, using directives. I think this now makes a lot more sense, yes? Component is made up of a template plus an object. An object return properties using the data function and has methods to handle events. We've seen this very nicely. Now let's zoom into the template. So in a template, I have the HTML template, the HTML that you all know, plus some data coming from the object. And to link the data from the object with the template, we use what is called directives. Okay? So what these directives allows us to do, I can read data from the objects using double curly brace. This is just a reading data from the objects. Or I can assign data from the object to a property. Sorry, to an attribute. If I want to assign it to an attribute, I have to use this syntax, either vbind, or I just come to the attribute and put colon. This is called a one-way binding. And the two-way binding is usually used with input fields, like input text boxes and drop downs and so on. What I am doing here, I am linking this input with this property. Whatever the value of this property, it will be displayed in the input, and if the user changes it, it will be reflected back on the data coming from the object. That's basically the idea. Here are some further examples. I am here binding href with the property URL. Another way, shorthand of doing it, I just put colon in front of the property. Event handling or event binding. I think it's better to call it event binding. In the event binding, I am basically linking this event with this function. If this event happens, this function should be called. And another way of doing it, shortcut of doing it, is click, call this event. And this is actually the big picture of how Vue.js really works. We have some object in memory, we have some visual representation. And the visual representation is nothing but a reflection of the object. So I bind properties from the object to the view, and I bind events that are coming from the view with the object methods. And of course, the object will be able to talk to the server side using fetch and the stuff that you already learned. So that's basically the idea. This is the summary, just to summarize everything that we have seen. This is how I do property binding to element attributes. This is how I do event binding, and this is how I do two-way binding. It's very, very powerful. So inshallah, next time I will show you more directives to be able to display a list of things, to be able to display things only if certain condition is true. You can also do this. And also something called computed properties. And then after this, we will see the communication between components. And finally, we'll see how we do validation and client-side routing.